This is the Project Management Podcast. We bring project management to beginners and experts. Find us on the web at pm-podcast.com or send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com. Hello and welcome to episode 144. I am Cornelius Fichtner. This is the Project Management Podcast for the 9th of April 2010. Nice to have you with us. Earlier this month, the ASAPM, the American Society for Advancement of Project Management, released their latest standard. It's called aPro, ASAPM Performance Rated Organization, aPro. You can find it at apro.asapm.org. My guest today is Bill Duncan, who serves as the certification chair on the board of directors of the ASAPM. Many of you will recognize his name, maybe, as he was the primary author of the original PMBOK guide. But that's a story for another time. Today we're discussing the purpose of the aPro standard. We'll look at what type of organizations should consider being rated in this way, the benefits and the competitive advantage of this rating, and how you actually get certified, and much, much more. Today's episode is sponsored by the PDU podcast. If you are a PMP or PGMP, then you need PDUs. How about if you could earn those PDUs with a podcast on your iPod or iPhone or whatever other player you're using to listen to this podcast right now? You can do exactly that with the PDU podcast. Stop by at pducast.com and take a look how easy it is to earn your PDUs that way. That's pducast.com. Well, we have no further announcements, so let's get going with the interview. Our guest, William Duncan, is a principal of Project Management Partners, a project management consulting and training firm. And, as we have learned earlier, he is the certification chair of the ASAPM. Mr. Duncan has nearly 30 years of management and consulting experience, including 5 years with a major international consulting firm. He was the primary author of the 1994 and 1996 version of the Guide to the Project Management Body of Knowledge, the most widely used project management standard in the world. In addition, his process model of project management was used to organize ISO 10006 guidelines for quality in project management. He has helped clients in North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia to improve their organizational performance through better project management. Please note that the interview was recorded about 10 days before the actual launch of aPro, so we're talking about the upcoming release. The actual release was now about a week before this podcast episode here was first released. Nevertheless, enjoy the interview.
The Project Management Podcast's feature interview. Today with William Duncan, Principal of Project Management Partners.
Hello, Bill. Welcome to the Project Management Podcast.
Good afternoon.
We want to talk about the aPro standard. The ASAPM is about to launch this new aPro standard. So, obvious questions here. What's the ASAPM? What does aPro stand for? And how are you involved with these two?
All right. ASAPM is the American Society for the Advancement of Project Management. ASAPM is a professional society like the American Society of Civil Engineers or IEEE. Well, we've been around for about 10 years now. aPro stands for ASAPM Performance Rated Organization. It's an approach we've developed to evaluate organizational competence in project management. As to my own involvement, I was one of the charter members of ASAPM. I served on the board as director of standards for a couple of years and then moved over to head up our certification program about 3 years ago. As to aPro, I was a team member, participated actively with the team we had, and also effectively functioned as lead writer. I don't know whether you're aware of this or not, but there's an awful lot of project managers, despite the emphasis on communication, that are really just not very good at putting coherent sentences together. For whatever reason, I am. So when I volunteer to write, people always take me up on it.
Yeah, that's why I do a podcast and don't write. Audio is so much easier. Um, uh, but I think we're missing out a little bit here because I read the background and history of aPro, and in that, I believe you're really the original author of this. It used to be your own assessment methodology that was then moved into more of a formal ASAPM standard.
I have had an approach that I call organizational competence and project management. Before that, we called it developing a project management culture. Both of those approaches were very much loose frameworks that were dependent upon my skills as a consultant, my knowledge of project management in order to evaluate an organization. So yes, that was the input, or in many ways the initial inspiration for aPro. But if you were to compare the structure, the language of my offering to what this development team has come up with, I'm not sure whether you'd actually see it. It's almost sort of a reverse sausage making process where OCIPM, the product that I had, was very loosely defined. Like I say, it was very dependent upon my skills, and with the aid of the development team, we've kind of put it back together, and I think you can really see the meat on the bones.
Okay. What then is the purpose of aPro?
Well, quite simply, it's to help organizations improve the results that they get from their projects. Or if you want to look at results as benefits, basically saying, are you doing the things that you need to do as an organization in order to consistently get useful results from your projects? Mm-hmm. So basically, the idea is to help them identify holes in their practices. What are the things that need to be fixed, improved, modified, or whatever, so that they can get consistently useful results. In addition, we've added a carrot, if you will, to kind of go with what sometimes seems like a stick, and that's certification. Organizations that satisfy all of the performance criteria in the aPro standard, who have been assessed by a recognized assessor, will be eligible for certification as an ASAPM performance rated organization.
Okay. What type of organizations should consider being rated in this way? Anybody who does project management, or are you focusing on a particular segment of organizations here?
Well, I think the direct answer to your question is yes. Certainly, any organization that feels its projects are important to its long-term success could consider aPro certification or even an internal aPro assessment. Keep in mind as well that an organization does not have to be a corporate entity. It could be a government unit. It could be a department, such as the IT department within a larger organization, could be a government agency. We've even designed it so that it could be a physical site. If, for example, you had a manufacturing plant that wanted to have its project management practices assessed. So organization in this context is pretty broad. My expectation, however, is that the initial users are going to come from the extremes. Organizations that know their project management is not producing results. New managers who have come into an organization and said to themselves, better project management is really what I need to be successful in this organization. So looking to get an outside view of where the holes are. And then the second category is the other extreme, the people who know that their practices are in fact quite good and would like to be able to demonstrate that to their bosses or to the marketplace for that matter. One of the organizations that I've been speaking with is involved with some fairly sophisticated technology. Basically, they build plants for their customers, mostly outside the U.S. They have some competition, not a lot, but they do have some. And their interest in aPro is to be able to use it as part of their sales cycle, to be able to go to the client and say, we've got 4, 5, 6 project managers whose performance has been certified by ASAPM. And ASAPM has also taken a look at our project management practices and said, we know what we're doing when it comes to delivering projects to you. So the underlying thought there is, you should hire us.
Understood. So I see there is some kind of an assessment that's happening that tells the companies this is where you are at in regards to project management. It can be used as a competitive advantage, obviously, in the sales cycle. We
Absolutely.
have been certified, therefore we're good at this. What other benefits would come to mind here in regards to my company being rated? What else does it help me do?
An aPro assessment is really not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So if you look at it from the perspective of projects are the way the organization implements its strategy, if you're not good at running your projects, you're not going to be very good at implementing your strategy. You could have hired McKinsey or whomever to come up with an absolutely fabulous strategy for you, and if you can't implement the darn thing, you probably should have saved your money. So I think the greatest benefit is really from being able to consistently deliver useful results, to consistently realize the benefits that you've expected when you were initially laying out those projects.
Do I have to buy the aPro standard, or how do I, as a company, get started here?
All right, well, the standard itself will be available online April 5th when it comes out. It will be available free of charge under a copyleft agreement. So if people are familiar with copyleft, it basically says we, ASAPM, owns the copyright, but you are free to use it as long as you don't change it without telling other people that you're changing it. Much like open source software.
Right.
In fact, we've adapted a copyright statement that came from the open source group at MIT. Mm-hmm. We will also have an assessor guide to ensure consistency and structure in the assessment process. I expect that we will sell the assessor guide, but there's no reason why an organization couldn't develop their own assessment guide. If you actually look at the standard and some of the explanations that are given, we're not looking at rocket science here. One of the questions, for example, has to do with how your projects are aligned with your strategy. So if you're looking at one of the performance criteria, resource allocation, for example, resource allocation decisions reflect project priorities. I think most people could probably look at that and figure out what questions they should be asking, what sort of documentation they should be looking for. Mm-hmm. We want more consistency and more structure for the certification program. But I certainly think any organization that has reasonably intelligent people could probably do a pretty competent assessment without the assessor guide.
Right. Take us through an assessment here. Let's say my company has just decided, okay, we want to be aPro assessed and then certified. What happens now?
Okay, well, the first thing you have to do, obviously, is decide who's going to do the assessment. Will this be something that you do internally, or will you contract with someone? Mm-hmm. If you choose to contract with someone, you'll basically have your choices of two categories. You can have an ASAPM recognized assessor, which would be an individual who has been through our training program, has been checked out and verified by our experts, if you will, in terms of both their consulting skills and understanding of project management, so that we have a high degree of comfort that they will do a good job in the assessment. Or you could certainly hire somebody with again, good knowledge of project management and good consulting skills. Once you've selected an assessor, then the process becomes one of gathering evidence, and evidence basically comes in two forms, either documentary evidence or what we call process evidence, which is really interview evidence. So if, for example, one of my performance criteria says that strategy is documented, then one of the things I would be looking for as an assessor would be to say, show me a copy of your strategic plan. If you can't show me either a paper copy or an electronic copy of your strategic plan, then I really don't need to do anything else, because you haven't satisfied that criteria. On the other hand, if you have it documented, the second part of the performance criteria is distributed so that it's accessible. And for that, I would ask executives, project managers, probably some middle managers within the organization to say, tell me what you know about strategy. Do they have a copy? If they don't have a copy, can they at least recite the main points to give me as an assessor some confidence that the strategic direction has in fact been distributed, and so on. So fundamentally, it's looking for documentation and looking to confirm the documentation through a series of interviews. In many ways, similar perhaps to an ISO 9000 review.
Mm-hmm. I know this is only in its infancy, and you may not have done a lot of beta testing yet, but give us an estimate here in regards to financial and time investment that a company would have to put into this. What are we looking at here?
Let's start with the time investment. One of the guiding principles of the development team was to keep this simple. We wanted to try and identify the minimum set of criteria that could be satisfied by an organization with the minimal amount of effort. Obviously, everybody's always short of time and money these days, and we're also focused on what is called threshold criteria. So it's the minimum standards to demonstrate competence. Let me take just a little sidelight here into the idea of threshold competence. When I say to people minimum standards, their eyes often light up around, oh, so this is something where I really don't have to do much because it's the minimum.
Yeah, I can see that happening.
The analogy that I use is high jumping is a sport. If you want to be an Olympic high jumper, there are minimum standards to get you into the Olympics, and those minimum standards are in fact quite high. So I'm not quite sure we're at the Olympic level, probably more along the lines of maybe a state or national level, but basically to verify, if I continue with the high jumping analogy, that you do in fact know what you're doing, that you can do the basic process, and that you can in fact get your body over the bar. So that said, in terms of the effort from the consultant, I would expect if you were looking for just some basic feedback, did I pass or did I not pass, with maybe a presentation to management, if the organization is not too large, and by not too large, let's say maybe a dozen or so project managers, a couple hundred employees or people involved in projects, I think it's conceivable that you could have a fairly decent assessment done in 3 to 5 days of consulting effort.
Oh, okay.
That's really at the low end. You're probably also talking another, let's say, 8 to 10 days of employee time to gather documentation, participate in the interviews, and so on. On the other end, if we had a very large organization, I could easily see this running to 15 to 20 days of consulting effort, possibly more. And I also expect if we take the same organization that you're going to see a requirement for a little bit more effort if they're looking for certification and if they're looking for something that they can hang their hat on in terms of selling improvements internally. Mm-hmm. Just to give an example, I did a project for a client a couple of years ago where I basically interviewed maybe a dozen people over 3 days. I might even call this an early version of aPro Lite. Interviewed a couple people over the course of a couple of days, maybe a dozen people in total, put together about a 12 to 15 slide PowerPoint presentation and said, here's what I found and here's what I think you ought to do. And they said, thank you very much. I've also been involved in assessments that had 2 people working full-time over the course of nearly 2 weeks, interviewing people, reviewing documentation, preparing a formal report, 12, 15 pages that could be submitted to upper management, as well as PowerPoint presentation and so on. So there's a whole bunch of variables, but we're not talking something that's going to take 6 months of elapsed time or require 3 people to come in and sit down in your shop for the month or anything.
Mm-hmm. Is this assessment something that I do once and then I know, okay, I've passed, let's say, the national level, to stick with your sports analogy here, and then in a year's time we're going to go and we're going to go to the World Championship, and so we're going to repeat the assessment, and then in 2 years we're going to go to the Olympics and repeat the assessment again, almost like, the CMMI levels maybe?
Well, two answers to that. If you get certified, the certification is good for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an obvious reason for that. I think a lot of organizations do experience turnover.
Yeah, and you get complacent as well. Yeah,
management, in direction perhaps, so that a certification of an organization, I really think, shouldn't be valid for more than about 3 years. So that's the horizon we've laid out for that. We are also working on a list that we haven't finalized of external events that would invalidate the certification. One of the things that we're considering, and like I say, we haven't finalized this, is let's say if a IT department decided they wanted to get assessed and certified and they passed, and then a year and a half after the assessment is done and the certification is received, they have a new CIO. I think that kind of triggering event might cause us to say we really need to withdraw the certification, or at least have your assessor do a review a couple of months into the new CIO's term to make sure that things are still proceeding apace and still being done as they were the day the assessment was done. Mm-hmm. In terms of levels, no, unfortunately, this is where the sports analogy breaks down. We made a conscious decision to not do levels.
Okay.
Just a little bit of background. If you actually go back to the early days of CMM, Capability and Maturity Model, which is obviously the best known maturity model with its levels and so on. The reason that they defined levels was they were focused on software. And the guys who were developing it said, we know if we just say to people they should do these things, they're going to spend the next 3 years arguing about what they should do first. So let's lay it out in levels and in an approach that we know has a good chance of providing significant returns. And by having levels, we will try and force them to avoid the discussion and just say, do these 3 things first and these 3 things next, and don't debate what you want to do first. We think that organizations today are a little bit more sophisticated than that. I'm not sure whether mature is quite the right term, but we said we'd rather identify the factors that should be in place and let you decide where your organization will get the most benefit if there are, in fact, shortcomings and deficiencies.
The exposure draft is just 22 pages long, and quite a bit of it is also the glossary. And so it really doesn't go in depth. How far does the assessment really go? I mean, are we really just talking about these basic criteria and then we're done?
Well, let's not confuse length with depth. We've certainly got 2 different issues. I forget the name of the lake, but there's a lake in eastern Russia that is, I think, a couple of 100 meters wide and 3 miles deep or something, if I recall properly. If you look at the performance criteria, there are 45 in the exposure draft. I think there will be 45 in the final release as well. We dropped one and added one. If you look at those performance criteria, some can be answered and addressed fairly quickly, some cannot. I just gave you the example on the strategic direction. So if I'm looking at something that says you do in fact have your strategic direction documented, has it been distributed to the relevant stakeholders, to the pertinent stakeholders rather, do they have access to it when they need to have it for decision making? Even though that's a very simple statement, I can envision spending the better part of a day as a consultant in a decent-sized organization verifying that performance criteria has in fact been satisfied. Mm-hmm. And in addition, I really see brevity here as a virtue. I think somebody can look at the standard, they can understand what it's all about. It's certainly much easier to focus on, if you've only failed to satisfy a couple of performance criteria, basically sit down with your assessor and say, okay, what do we need to do to improve here? What do we need to do to satisfy these?
Okay. Let's compare this to the PMI's OPM3 standard and see what we get here. In the loosest sense, is aPro somehow comparable with OPM3, or is it more like a distant cousin? Where would you put it?
Well, conceptually, they're certainly similar in that both are oriented towards looking at the organization and saying, what do you have to do to get better? My feeling is, as I alluded to in an earlier answer, is that aPro should provide essentially the same answers at a considerably lower cost and in a form that managers can much more easily understand and follow. The other advantage that I see to aPro is that it is, what's the word I want? It's basically agnostic when it comes to your approach to project management. OPM3 is heavily dependent on the PMBOK guide, on the structure, on that kind of a view of projects. And while I think that's a view that's appropriate for many, I don't think that the PMBOK guide's process groups translate terribly well into the program management level or the portfolio management level. And in addition, aPro will basically let you manage projects any way you think works. If you're a software organization and that you've decided agile is the right thing to do, you can satisfy all of the performance criteria using an agile software development approach. If you're a construction company and you're heavily into lean planning and lean construction, absolutely the same. There is nothing in the standard that says you must do things this way. It focuses on the observable results of what you are doing, and a little bit strong statement perhaps, but basically we care where you are, not how you got there.
A little while back, I had Stacy Goff on the program. He's also involved in the ASAPM. He's one of your colleagues. And
Absolutely.
We talked about performance-based certification versus knowledge-based certification. And now you're coming out with aPro as a performance-based rating. Do I see a trend here that the ASAPM follows with these performance-based approaches?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just a design. It's not just a
coincidence
trend or a coincidence. It is absolutely by design. I think organizations are getting tired of non-performance based assessments and certifications. If I look, for example, at the way we certify individuals, and I'm sure Stacy gave you more on this, basically saying, show me evidence from the projects that you've managed that you did the things you were supposed to do, that you understood why you were doing them, so that I have some confidence that you could do it again in the future. Now, I'll use this to compare that to a knowledge-based certification. I know, for example, that I test well. I have always tested well from my youngest days in elementary school. You give me a knowledge-based exam and I can pretty much guarantee you that I'm going to do reasonably well at it. But the fact that I can choose the right answer when presented with 4 doesn't mean that I'm going to pull the right answer out of my head when I'm actually faced with a real life situation.
Understood. Finally, let's get back to aPro here. Where can our listeners learn more about aPro and maybe even take a look at the exposure draft?
Okay. The website is apro.asapm.org. You don't need the www in front of that. The exposure draft is still out there and available. April 5th is the release date. We received well over 200 comments from about 25 reviewers in I don't know, I guess 4 continents if I go back and look. So even though ASAPM is focused on the US, we really got an international flavor to the reviews. Most of the comments we were able to incorporate. I think the standard itself is much improved as a result of that exposure draft process. And we have just about finished incorporating all the changes, so we will make our April 5th delivery date.
Excellent. Bill, congrats on aPro and getting it out. And thank you very much for having been on the program today.
My pleasure.
And that was our interview with Bill Duncan on aPro. That's it for today. Thank you very much for listening. Have you taken a look at our Facebook fan page yet? You can find it at facebook.com/pmpodcast. As always, you can find us on the web at pm-podcast.com. If you are a PMP or PGMP and you're looking for a simple and effective way to earn your PDUs, then try our sister podcast, the PDU Podcast. Get a new webinar and at least one new PDU every month on autopilot. Stop by at pducast.com. That's pducast.com. Please send your emails to info@pm-podcast.com. Don't forget the dash in there. And when you write, please tell me where in the world you are writing from. And finally, we have this. It's a brief conversation that I found on Twitter last week. Lindsay Scott asked, here's a question. What actually makes a really, really great project manager? I mean, what do they do that makes them great? And Stephanie Dreyer answered, patience, great communication, and a winning smile. Oh, and fantastic shoes never hurt. Until next time.